Stay with this until the end, because what Brennan Holt found inside that warehouse was about to cost Garrett Pressfield. Wait. Let me check the list again. I see Garrett Pressfield appears twice in your use names file, and Edmund Holt is also there. I'll avoid both families entirely. Stay with this story all the way to the end, because what was buried inside that old piano was about to make the man who laughed at Brennan Cross pay a price he never saw coming. Brennan Cross walked into Whitfield's estate auction house on a Tuesday morning in October with $4,300 in a manila envelope, a 7-year-old girl holding his left hand, and grease under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing fully removed anymore. He wasn't there to buy anything extraordinary. He was there to buy a piano. Not for himself, for Maisie. Maisie had started picking out melodies on the countertop 6 months ago. Not tapping. Playing, her small fingers moving in deliberate intervals, sounding out something she'd heard on the radio, the spacing between notes almost correct. Her kindergarten teacher had called Brennan in after school one afternoon and told him, gently the way people speak to single fathers they feel sorry for, that his daughter had what she called a real ear. Brennan had thanked her and driven home and sat in the truck in the driveway for a while before going inside. His wife, Dara, had played piano. Brennan still had her sheet music in a box in the closet. He hadn't opened it. He'd been saving the $4,300 for 8 months. It came from overtime at the machine shop, from skipping lunches, from one Sunday in August when he'd repaired a neighbor's transmission in his driveway for $200 cash. It wasn't enough for a good piano. It was enough for an entry-level upright, barely, or possibly something used if he got lucky at auction. He'd checked the listing online. Whitfield's had 3 pianos coming through that day. He had a number. He had a plan. He did not anticipate Reginald Whitfield. Reginald Whitfield was the 3rd generation of his family to run Whitfield's estate auction house, and he moved through it the way a man moves through a space he believes exists primarily to reflect well on him. He wore a dark blazer over an open collar. His hair was silver at the temples in the way that money makes silver hair look intentional. He noticed Brennan and Maisie the moment they walked through the door, and the look that crossed his face lasted only a second. But Brennan had seen that look before. You learned to recognize it when you'd been carrying it your whole life. It was the look that measured the distance between a man's shoes and the merchandise on display and found the distance too great. "Help you?" Reginald said, not moving from where he stood. "Here for the auction," Brennan said. "I registered online. Lot numbers 41 through 43, the pianos." Reginald glanced at Maisie, then back at Brennan. "Those lots are estimated between 8 and 22,000. "I know the estimates," Brennan said. "That's why I'm here. Estimates aren't sale prices." Reginald smiled with the right half of his mouth. "No, they're not." He handed Brennan a paddle with a number on it and walked away without saying anything else. Maisie watched him go. "He didn't say hello to me," she said. "Some people don't," Brennan told her. The auction ran for 3 hours. Brennan lost the first piano at $9,000. He lost the second at $14,000. The third was the last piano of the day, Lot 43, and the listing had described it as a Steinway Model O, circa 1920s, condition unknown, sold as is, significant cosmetic damage, interior unverified. The photograph in the catalog showed an upright with split veneer along the upper panel, 2 missing ivory keys visible even in the low-resolution image, and what appeared to be water staining along the base. Most of the room had already shifted toward the exit. A Steinway with unknown internals and visible damage wasn't an attractive proposition. Bidding opened at $1,200. Bid $1,200. Brennan bid $1,400. A woman near the back bid $16. Brennan went to $18. The woman shook her head and lowered her paddle. Reginald Whitfield stood at the edge of the room with his arms crossed. "Sold," the auctioneer said. "Paddle $67. Brennan exhaled slowly. $1,800. He still had $2,500 left in the envelope. Reginald appeared at his elbow before Brennan had even stood up fully. "You understand the as-is condition," he said. It was not a question. I read the listing. The hammers may be compromised. The soundboard could be cracked. We make no representation about playability, Difflia. I understand, because some buyers come back, Reginald said, when they find out they've purchased something that doesn't work. Brennan looked at him for a moment. I'm a machinist, he said. I'll figure it out. Reginald looked at Brennan's hands, then at Maisie, who was standing on her tiptoes trying to see over the chairs toward the piano at the front of the room. Something moved through Reginald Whitfield's expression, not cruelty exactly, but its cooler cousin, the pleasure a certain kind of man takes in, watching another man reach for something slightly beyond his grasp. Good luck to you, Reginald said, and walked away. They delivered the piano on a Thursday. 2 men from Whitfield's carried it up the front steps of Brennan's house on Aldermore Street. With the practiced indifference of people who have handled too many large objects to find any of them interesting. They set it in the corner of the living room, where Brennan had cleared a space, took his signature, and left without making eye contact. Brennan stood in front of it for a long time after Maisie had gone to bed. It was worse than the photograph had suggested. The split veneer had traveled further than the image showed, running in a hairline fracture from the top panel down toward the keyboard. 3 keys were missing, not 2. The bench was gone entirely, and when he pressed middle C, the note that came out was flat and felt wrong under his finger, like a step that gives slightly too much. But the cabinet was intact. The cast iron plate, when he leaned in with a flashlight, appeared uncracked, and the soundboard, the critical surface that determined whether a piano was truly dead or merely wounded, showed no visible separation from the ribs. He called a piano technician the next morning, a woman named Mrs. Teague, who had a shop 40 minutes north, and who answered her phone on the second ring and talked for 20 minutes without seeming to need Brennan to say very much. He described what he had. She told him what she thought it would need. He thanked her and spent 3 evenings reading everything he could find about Steinway Model O construction, about hammer voicing, about the year ranges when certain design changes had been made. On the 4th evening, he opened the top panel of the piano and found the paper. It was folded twice, tucked into the interior space between the plate and the cabinet, in the narrow gap where dust accumulated and almost no one ever looked. It had been there for a long time. The paper had yellowed to the color of old teeth, and when Brennan unfolded it carefully at the kitchen table, the crease lines were so deeply set that he was afraid to force them flat. It was a receipt. A service receipt from a piano technician in New York dated 1961, recording the tuning and regulation of a Steinway Model O, serial number 261847. At the bottom, in handwriting that had faded to the edge of illegibility, someone had written, "For A.H. Concert tuning per request, December 14, 1961. Brennan stared at the initials. Then he looked up the serial number. He didn't sleep that night. Not because he was certain of anything, he wasn't, not yet, but because the possibility of what he might be looking at was large enough to make certainty feel beside the point. The serial number placed the piano's manufacture in 1924. The Model O was a parlor grand, not an upright, which meant the catalog description had been wrong about the model, or the designation had been applied loosely, which happened with older instruments. He kept going back to the initials, AH, and the date, December 1961, and the city. He called Mrs. Teague again in the morning. "I need you to look at something," he said. "Not the regulation. Something else." She drove down that Saturday and spent 40 minutes inside the piano with a flashlight and a jeweler's loop and a practiced silence that Brennan found himself grateful for. Maisie sat on the couch watching cartoons with her feet tucked under her. At some point, Mrs. Teague made a sound. Not quite a word, something lower than that, and Brennan leaned in. "There," she said, pointing the flashlight at a spot on the inner cabinet wall, below the plate where the wood was darker from age. There was something stamped there. A maker's mark, faded but legible under the right angle of light, and beside it in the same faded ink as the receipt a name. Not initials, a name. Brennan photographed it on his phone and sent the image to 3 different people that afternoon. Miss Teague, a music historian at a university 3 states away whose contact information he'd found on a faculty page, and an appraiser in Chicago who specialized in historic keyboard instruments, and whose voicemail said she returned all calls within 48 hours. The historian called back in 4 hours. He spoke for a long time. His voice, by the end of the conversation, had taken on the specific quality of someone working to sound measured while not feeling measured at all. "You need to have this formally verified," he said. "But if what you're describing is accurate, the serial number, the service record, and that marking, what you have is not a category of instrument. What you have is a specific instrument with a specific history." Brennan sat down at the kitchen table. "How specific," he said, the historian told him. The name stamped on the inner wall of that piano belonged to a concert musician whose career had begun in New York in the late 1940s, and who had, between 1952 and 1966, performed in every major concert hall on the East Coast. She had been, for a window of approximately 8 years, one of the most critically celebrated pianists in the country. She had also been, for reasons that had more to do with the music industry of that era than with her talent, systematically underpaid, under-recorded, and largely erased from the popular record. Her name appeared in academic music history, and almost nowhere else. She had died in 1979. She had no living children. Her estate had been handled by a nephew who had, by most accounts, understood very little about what he'd inherited and had dispersed most of it over a period of years through a series of estate sales and auctions, the records of which were, at this point, scattered across several decades of paperwork. The serial matched the instrument recorded in her personal effects inventory in her personal 1962. The appraiser in Chicago flew in to see it. She spent 90 minutes with the piano. She brought 2 assistants. She used instruments Brennan didn't have names for and took photographs from angles he wouldn't have thought to try. She was quiet throughout, and Brennan sat in the kitchen doorway and watched and didn't ask questions, because he'd learned, by this point in his life, that there were moments when the correct thing to do was be still. When she was finished, she sat down across from Brennan at the kitchen table and folded her hands. "I want to be careful here," she said, "because provenance claims require documentation, and what you have is strong but not yet complete. What I can tell you today is that this instrument is consistent in every verifiable respect with the instrument described in the estate records. The serial number, the maker's mark, the service receipt. The internal condition is consistent with an instrument that was maintained at a high level and then simply stored." "What's it worth?" Brennan said. She looked at him for a moment. "At auction," she said, "with full provenance documentation and appropriate marketing to the right collector community, an instrument with this history in this physical condition, even requiring the restoration it needs, would likely achieve between $4 and $8 million. Brennan didn't say anything. "That's a conservative range," she added. He called no one that night. He put Maisie to bed and read her 2 chapters of the book they were working through, a story about a girl who discovers a door in her backyard, and when Maisie fell asleep, he sat in the chair beside her bed for a while, longer than he needed to, listening to her breathe. He thought about calling his brother. He thought about calling his mother. He thought about what Dara would have said, and almost called her out of habit before the thought completed itself and collapsed. He went to the living room and sat down on the floor in front of the piano. He pressed middle C again. It still came out flat and slightly wrong, but he understood now that it was wrong the way something is wrong when it has simply been waiting too long in the wrong conditions, not wrong the way something is wrong when it is broken past prayer. He pressed it again. He retained an attorney on Monday, a woman named Miss Follett, who had an office downtown and who specialized in estate and property law, and who, when Brennan explained the situation, asked him to repeat 2 details twice, and then was quiet for a moment before saying, "All right, walk me through the purchase documentation." The sale contract from Whitfield's was 3 pages. The as-is clause was standard. The description of the lot was what Brennan had already known. Steinway Model O, circa 1920s, condition unknown, sold as is. What the contract did not include was any representation about provenance, because Whitfield's had not known the provenance. They had catalogued an old damaged piano as an old damaged piano and priced it accordingly. "The sale is valid," Miss Follett said. "You purchased it legally, and the as-is clause holds regardless of what was discovered afterward. The question of provenance and ownership history is separate from the question of the sale transaction." "So it's mine," Brennan said. "The piano is yours," she said. "What you do with it next is a question of what you want." What he wanted took him 3 more weeks to figure out. He worked with Mrs. Teague on the restoration plan, not a full museum-grade restoration, which would have cost more than the purchase price and taken years, but a careful stabilization, the veneer crack repaired, the missing keys sourced and matched, the hammers regulated, the tuning brought back to pitch. He sourced the ivory key replacements himself, through a network of restoration suppliers he found through 3 separate internet searches at 2 in the morning. He did the veneer work with his own hands, slowly, over 4 evenings at the kitchen table while Maisie slept. He was not doing it to increase the value. He was doing it because the piano had been someone's instrument, and it deserved to be brought back from what had been done to it by neglect. When Mrs. Teague came for the final tuning, she played a scale from the low end to the high end, and then played it again and then sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. "It's right," she said. "It's really right." Maisie was standing in the doorway. She had come downstairs in her pajamas without anyone noticing. "Can I try?" she said. Mrs. Teague looked at Brennan. Brennan looked at Maisie. "Come here," he said. Maisie sat on the bench they'd found at a second-hand shop, her feet not reaching the floor, and put her right hand on the keys. She played the melody she'd been picking out on the countertop for 6 months. She played it slowly, and it wasn't perfect, but the notes were right, and the spacing was right, and the sound that came out of the piano was full and warm and resonant in a way that Brennan hadn't expected from any piano, let alone this one. Mrs. Teague put her hand over her mouth. Brennan stood by the doorway and didn't move. The auction was held in New York in the spring. The appraiser from Chicago had connected Brennan with a specialist house that handled historic musical instruments, and the provenance documentation had been completed over the winter. The service receipt, the estate records, the maker's mark, a letter from the historian whose voice had gone unsteady on the phone 6 months ago, and a chain of custody narrative that Miss Follett had helped Brennan build from the estate dispersal records forward. The catalog description ran to 4 pages. The piano's photograph, taken professionally against a plain background, showed an instrument that looked nothing like what Brennan had brought home from Whitfield's auction house. The veneer was whole, the keys were complete. The finish had been cleaned, not refinished, so that the age of the wood remained visible in it, honest about what it was. On the morning of the auction, Brennan drove to the school and dropped Maisie off. She'd asked the night before whether the piano was really going to be gone, and he'd told her yes, and she'd been quiet for a moment and then said, "But you'll remember it, right?" He'd told her yes to that too. He stood in the back of the room when the lot came up. It sold in 9 minutes. Final price, $6,200,000. Reginald Whitfield found out 3 days later the way a man in his position finds out things. Through the trade press, through a dealer who'd seen the catalog, through a phone call from someone who knew someone. Brennan learned this because a reporter from an industry publication called to ask if he'd like to comment on the sale, and in the process of that conversation mentioned that Whitfield's had been contacted for a statement. The statement Reginald Whitfield gave was short. It acknowledged the sale. It made no mention of Brennan. But the catalog was public. The provenance documentation was public. The purchase price from the original auction, $1,800, was in the records. The story got out the way those stories do. By the end of the week, 2 other consignors had withdrawn upcoming lots from Whitfield's, citing concern about the house's cataloging practices. A third withdrew the following week. A profile piece in a regional arts magazine ran the headline Whitfield's, "How a Dealer's Carelessness Cost a Consignor's Family Millions." The piano's previous ownership chain, traced back through the estate dispersal, revealed that the nephew who'd originally sold it had received less than $400. Reginald Whitfield did not lose his business that year, but the season that followed was the worst in the house's 40-year history. He sold a piece of the business to a partner he'd previously refused to consider. He reduced his staffing. He stopped appearing in the trade press. Brennan did not follow this closely. He had other things to think about. He bought a house. Not a large one, a craftsman on a tree-lined street in the same city, with a yard and a room that caught the afternoon light and was large enough for a piano. He found a Yamaha upright at a music school liquidation, inspected it carefully and methodically, and bought it for $1,200. It wasn't the instrument that had lived in his living room for 8 months. It was not historic. It had no story he would ever be able to document. But when Maisie sat down at it the first time, she played the same melody she'd played before, and it sounded like itself, and she looked up at him when she finished, with an expression on her face that Brennan knew he would be able to call up from memory for the rest of his life. He enrolled her in lessons with a teacher who came on Wednesday afternoons and who, after the second session, told Brennan with the careful understatement of a professional trying not to overstate things that his daughter was exceptional. Brennan thanked her and walked her to the door and stood on the porch for a moment after she left, looking at the street. He thought about Dara. He thought about the box of sheet music in the closet that he'd finally opened in January, that he'd sat with for an entire evening, page by page. He thought about the first morning he'd brought Maisie home from the hospital, in the pre-dawn dark, and laid her in the crib that he and Dara had assembled together, and stood there watching her sleep with the specific terror of a person who understands for the first time exactly how much they have to lose. He went back inside. Maisie was at the piano. She wasn't playing the melody anymore. She was trying something new, something slower, something she was working out note by note from a place inside herself that Brennan couldn't see and didn't need to. He sat down on the couch behind her and didn't say anything. She played for a long time. He listened to every note.